Hey folks, so this has been rather anticipated for a while. I hate to break the bad news to you, but this planet shader isn't out quite yet. But I do want to I want to start the documentation process. This is something that's a little bit complicated to use, and you won't be getting, be getting pretty good results out of the box pretty much. I'm gonna make a whole lot more node groups and stuff so that's easier to use for instance like a fast cumulus layer that will work very well, but for now unfortunately it's just not ready for just regular consumers. But I do want to show you sort of how I work in it and how this all works. So I've got a basic setup right here. I don't have any atmospheric clouds, but I wanted to show you how I set up a scene here and how I set up the planet. So there's some other stuff that's like less intuitive and more advanced that I'll be getting into later, not in this tutorial because I want to keep this relatively brief, but this will just cover the basics. So I'm just going to show you how I shape some cumulus clouds. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go into this group tab. I need to get an atmosphere layer, and by the way, there are different materials. This will all be sort of condensed into like, I'm gonna set up like an empty or something that has a material that has all the node groups. This master atmosphere composition inside of here is where you put your atmosphere layers. These are all node groups, and you have to connect each input, each input into each input and each output into each output. So for instance, this position in goes into this. So all 5 of those go in. Anything that has an in goes to one of these. And you can also string these up in a chain. You just connect the outs to the ends, all 5 of these. Usually atmospheres you don't have to do that, but that is how you add stuff like new cloud layers, except you do this in the cloud. So I connect all 5 of these up, and the extinction, and boom. So we have this white atmosphere. This is currently not really looking great for an Earth-like planet, so in order to do this, set this up, we have to first add an atmosphere color that's something other than black, and I'm going to turn this haze density down to 0 because that's the haze layer. So I'm going to turn this up to 1, and I'm going to set this to like blue. You can see we have a lot of layering. This is a little bit intense. So you can change the amount of layering from all the way from 0, which is just smooth, to a little bit of layering to like a ton. That is up for you guys to decide. I like to set it at 0.3 to 0.5 or so. I'm going to set 0.4. This relay anisotropy, that's going to be the anisotropy of this. So if you set like something like 0.9, you'll see it's very congregated over there. I'm going to set this to, I usually use 0.4. Alrighty. This is a little bit blue for my taste. Let's go back there. And then this absorption color. Basically just, it's going to be the absorption. Let's see. We need to add absorption amount. And let's turn this down a little bit. So this is going to be, we want it to be like yellowish red for atmosphere absorption. I'm going to set this like 2 or so. And I'm also going to change the thickness a little bit down because this is a little bit harsh. Also increase the brightness to maybe 2. So that's the atmosphere there. I'm going to, so this ozone is the next thing we're going to configure. So I like to set this to slightly blue color, and it's a little bit down. And the ozone layer will add just an element of, well, saturate the atmosphere a little bit. So I'm gonna pull this back So if we add in an ozone layer, you can see it gets more saturated. I usually set this at like 2. Set this to about 1.5, 2. There's just a little bit of tweaking that you have to do for each of these. Alright, so that's the basic atmosphere layer. Now we can add in some haze. This haze is really thick. Haze is usually congregated at the bottom, so I like to do 0.1 to 0.2 for a haze thickness. You can see if we turn it up a whole lot, we can still get a very hazy atmosphere. That looks pretty neat. You can also connect noise textures and stuff to this, add a little bit of variation. But yeah, I'm going to set this to about 2. I think the anisotropy is good. Let's see, I'll change this to about 1.5. Actually, I'm going to leave that 1 and I'll change it later if I need to. You can change the color. All of this. It's actually pretty cool. Anyways, yeah. The absorption color can be a bit finicky to play around with. Because it's so sensitive. But it shouldn't give you too many problems. It's just sort of a matter of getting the feel right. Turn the thickness up a little bit. Density down. So that's it for the atmosphere. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the clouds shader. And this master cloud composition is where we're going to add our clouds. So today we're just going to be focusing on cumulus clouds and like the big ones. So it's not going to be like a complete scene. But you'll see sort of how powerful this shading algorithm is, because it will make your clouds, like of any shape, look like clouds, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to add in a group. Oh, I forgot to do something. So you can access the master atmosphere shader right here, or whatever, master atmosphere composition. So this was designed in mind for you to be able to go into the atmosphere, and you can even get surface level shots if you have clouds and such. But you can set your the glow of the sun to certain values, and you can change the anisotropy and stuff. So if you want it to be smaller, you can do that sort of thing. It's pretty cool. And you can see the atmosphere is pretty much noiseless, which is always very nice. Anyways, let's make some clouds. So the same deal goes with clouds for creating cloud layers, except instead of the master atmosphere, the atmosphere layer, you have the cloud layer. And this has one extra input, which is the shadow input. I'm gonna extend this out a little bit. And you connect all of these in. And all of these out. It can be a little bit annoying sometimes, but it's rewarding because you get good results. Anyways, so let's go through some of these settings. There's a couple of these. So cloud color, it's pretty self-explanatory. That's just color. Luminosity is how bright these are. The cloud height is the height at which the cloud layer starts within like the cloud domain. And cloud thickness is how thick that cloud layer is, and then this height texture is how high up those clouds go. So it starts from this cloud height, that's the bottom, and then it adds this height texture to it, and it sort of displaces the clouds. This cloud sharpness is basically just how sharp the clouds are, the edges. I'll show you how all these work in like dynamic action. And then this cloud density texture is how dense these are. Cloud anisotropy is this anisotropy works. And the shadow opt-in is a little bit more complicated, but if this is the lowest layer, you want to set this to 1. If it's a layer higher than that, you can set it to 0. or you should set it to 0. And shadow darkness, that's gonna be an enhancement pass. There's a shadow enhancement pass, and that will just augment that. Okay, so right now we aren't seeing anything because this height texture is 0, so it's not thick at all. But if we set it to just 1, we can see like we're gonna get clouds. That's pretty cool. Well, clouds in quotation marks because it's just a bunch of cloud. So let's actually add a texture to this. So very important, this group input, you need to use the position as the basic input vector for anything. This is what it queries the textures from in the shader. So if you don't use this, the shading is going to be non-existent pretty much. So let's add in a noise texture. Let's just add in some basic clouds that don't really look too great, but just to show you sort of what it is. So let's set this to like 125, add a little bit of roughness and detail, and then add in a color ramp. And you will soon be able to see. Plug this into the cloud height texture first, and you can see, boom, we got some clouds. Very basic clouds, but still clouds. I'm going to turn up the cloud sharpness to about 256, just to get some sharpness, and then the density, I'm going to turn up maybe to 5 for now. And I'm going to crush these values in a little bit. Okay, so these are like as basic can be, but they still actually look pretty decent. The shading is very good. The viewport preview is a little bit slow, but the trade-off for that is that you can use less samples, which is always nice. So these clouds are pretty dark, so I'm going to change their luminosity up to about 2. And voila. Let's let it render out a little bit so you can see all those details. Yeah, that is pretty neat. So in our camera view, if we want to zoom in on one cloud, you can see we get those silver lining, and it also will add a nice fall off to simulate that indirect light scattering, which is very nice, and we can augment that by changing the density, which is pretty cool. Anyways, so let's get into actually how to shape these clouds so that they look more realistic, because you'll notice if we do this, like, these aren't super realistic. They look alright, but they aren't the greatest. Like when we look at something like this, let me find some good clouds. I guess you can't really zoom in too much. Anyways, clouds are pretty vertical, at least these big cumulus clouds. And if we try to do that in here, we get a couple things happening. Is that some of these are going to look fine, but a lot of these are just going to end up looking very procedural. Like for instance, you can see it on a few things here. There's going to be disconnected parts and such. It's just going to look blobby and a little bit weird. So how do you fix this, you might ask? Basically what I like to do is I like to use a lower res texture and then distort them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this texture and I'm going to control shift click to preview it, and I'm going to add in a vector math normalize, which is basically going to constrain this to only vary on the axes that are like perpendicular to the plane, so it's going to essentially just be stretched out a whole lot, and you'll see why we're doing this shortly. So this will kill all like the overhanging detail and stuff. You can see it's like pointy and weird, but what we're going to do is we're going to lower the detail a lot to like 2. That way this is a little bit more blobby. Sometimes messing with these color ramps is a little bit weird. You gotta let it compute a little bit. So I'm really gonna like crush these in. I'm gonna use ease, so we ease into it a little bit. But basically the point of this is that we can make these really vertical structures and nothing is going to be like blobby and disconnected and such. So now what we can do, I'm gonna add another thing here and lower this slightly so that we don't get any nasty cutoff. I'm gonna zoom in on one of these clouds. So now what we can do is we can distort this a little bit to add back in that detail. So after this normalize, we're going to take this noise texture. I'm going to vary the scale a little bit. I'm going to add in some detail. Let's just put it back at 8. Add back in some roughness. I'm going to add a little bit more roughness in there. We can afford it. And I'm going to use vector math. I'm going to subtract 0.5 from each channel on here. I mentioned this in a few times. If you are familiar with nodes, you know sort of why that is. Because if we just take this color output, it's going to add a positive number to each channel here, and that will shift the texture over a little bit more than we want it to. So this will just make it so that it's a little bit more even, and we can get a better preview. Even though this doesn't really matter too much, it's just good practice. And I'm going to scale this down, and then I will add this back into the vector. So it's important the add comes after the normalize. Oh, this should not be normalized. Yeah, it's important the add come after the normalize and that this is not normalized, because this will essentially kill any vertical detail. And it's very noisy right now. It's because we're scaling this by a lot. So I'm going to set this down to like 0.01, and suddenly it makes a little bit more sense why we're doing this. Now this is still a lot. I think 0.05 might be best. So what we essentially get here is we get this cloud with very few blobby bits that aren't connected, and it's shaped more or less like an actual cloud, which is very nice. And if we let it render out, all the noise will get killed and we can see sort of what it'll look like. Although you guys probably get the picture. There's a little bit of a weird line. You can remove that if you sort of know what you're doing with the shading. But yeah. Now let's add in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to take this color ramp and I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to use something to vary the density, which is going to be this thing. This is going to be our density channel. I'm going to change this back to linear. So I'm essentially going to take this math, then I'm going to add I'm going to multiply this by something, and I'm going to use a power node as well, so we can sharpen up those edges. I'm also going to use a power node on here. And I'll put this into the cloud density texture. And we need to multiply this by, let's start with 25 to see how that looks. You might have to adjust the roughness in these a little bit because we're still getting some blobby bits. I think that's good. Let's up this to like 50. I usually use 50 to 100 for these things. I should come to think of it, I think I might just use this channel. That way we get a little bit more variety in this. That's pretty neat. Let's see what it looks like without it, and we can see what it looks like with it. It's just constantly a matter of changing everything. It takes a little bit of time to get it right. Yeah, I actually think that's probably the best choice. So let's see. Let's put this into the cloud density texture. Let's pan around to see what some of these clouds look like. So this is a little bit more of a front focused view. I'm going to let it resolve. You can see I've built into the shading engine that there are dark edges and like silver linings and stuff on these. It's not super apparent in this one right now, but once it renders out, you'll see it will be shaded like an actual cloud, not just volume. And that was a little bit of a difficult battle to fight, but it does look like a cloud. Alrighty, so that's sort of just the basics of making some Cumulus stuff. I will do a quick render, and I will add in some texture for some smaller Cumulus clouds into this, and I'll sort of show you how it looks. I'm also gonna, this is rather homogeneous right now, so I'm gonna add in some like constraining factors, like so for instance it doesn't look like it's just Cumulus. I'll show you guys how to do all of that in a later video, but for now I am going to sign off, and I will show you the render I come up with. So I will see you guys later. Alright, so this is about 5 more minutes of work and like 10 minutes of rendering. This usually renders quite a bit faster. I've been doing some other stuff in parallel, so it's been taking a little bit longer. So if you're dedicating your computer to like solely rendering this and you make some optimizations, you can easily get this down to like 2 minutes a frame. I want to show you a little bit about what I did. This is, sorry, wrong node group. So this render is it's pretty shitty. A lot of people are gonna be like, what? No, it's not shitty. Yeah, it is. The atmosphere is a little bit off. I think it's a little bit too dense, and these clouds over here don't look the greatest, but you know, it's alright. It's alright. This was just made in a couple minutes. Takes a little bit longer to get super good results, but basically all I did here is I added these noises to basically sort of limit the effect of this one. I'm just multiplying that by that, and then I added some these smaller clouds that are just driven by a texture, and you can see this is going into a maximum node, which is going into cloud height texture, and they're multiplied by only a little bit, so they aren't displacing the clouds as much, but yeah. And then they also go into maximum with the density so that I can get more density. As a rule of thumb, small clouds I usually shade them denser because they need to get more detail, but anyways, that is that. I want to show you what this looks like if you actually spend like a couple hours like really fine-tuning it, like I did last night. So I rented out an HDRI. This is on my Patreon, by the way. This is a $5 tier. That you can get this is 16K and everything. Basically, this is the same method I used to create these Cumulus clouds. So you can see when they're integrated into something like this, they're a lot better. And basically, the shot breakdown is, I mean, it's just expanded on that. There are a few more cloud layers. So there's the Cumulus clouds, right? And I'm going to zoom in a little bit because the texture can hold up. So there are these Cumulus clouds here. You can tell them because they have overhangs and such, and they look like actual clouds. And then there's these smaller Cumulus, and then I layer on top of that the same texture but scaled differently, so it gets like those really small clouds like you can see over there. So that's all done in one cloud layer because they all start at the same height, so you can do that. And then I have this second layer which is a little bit higher, but it overhangs a little bit, and it's sort of connected to these cumulus clouds so that they can, I don't know, so that they have like a bedding of sort or whatever. I don't know, it's just usually how it happens. And I have these wispy clouds on top that look a little bit strange right now. I was experimenting with some shading, but I mean, they're tolerable. And you can see when you take the time to like properly shade these, even over here where it's like really close up, and you can see all the detail and such, they still hold up very fine, or very well. You just have to know a little bit. So I think if I had to redo these ones, because these are a little bit wonky, just make them a little bit denser, and kill some of the indirect lighting, and also make the atmosphere better. The atmosphere will contribute to about half of the cloud's realism. Let me actually turn this off so you can see a little bit more clearly all the detail over here. Yeah, so it's pretty neat. You can see some of those thin, like, what do they call them? Silver lining and stuff over here. And I think it's just a really cool showcase of how this, how these clouds look. So I'm trying to get this user friendly, and I'm gonna update this tutorial. I'll probably hide it and then re-upload it with an updated version once this thing is actually ready. I have to kind of moron proof it, no offense, but I mean, this is not, people aren't really morons, but this is just so complicated and somebody's gonna find some way to break it through no fault of their own. I just like to call it moron proofing because it's funny. But yeah, that is it for today. Thank you fellas for tuning in. I will show my Patreon. I've got this. I've got a bunch of other HDRIs. Not all of this quality, but you can use them if you subscribe. They're usually on the $5 or $10 tier. Join my Discord server. That's where I post more updates about this. This will be likely $50. I'll try to get it on Blender Market and Gumroad when it's ready. It's currently in beta testing right now, so I have some beta testers. But yeah, leave your recommendations for how the GUI, how you want the GUI to work and stuff. I'm just going to use node groups. I don't have the energy to code anything right now. But yeah, thank you guys. Say hello to Dennis, my editor, which I now have an editor. I don't pay him, he's a slave. Alright, see you fellas. Have a good one.